There was a time in football when being a striker was not something you had to explain. You didn't need to justify your movements. You didn't need to prove yourself without the ball. You didn't need to even apologise for standing still because standing still was often the point. You were judged on moments, on whether you arrived when everyone else was late or when the game tightened and the noise grew heavy. You could still find that pocket of space where there wasn't meant to be any. In an era that would later be remembered for Galacticos, for branding, for footballers who became global celebrities as much as players, one striker built a career on something quieter, something older. Timing, reading the game, and scoring goals that arrive without spectacle but with consequence. Fernando Morientes was never the loudest name on the team sheet. He wasn't the future of football, and he wasn't the face of an era. But on Europe's biggest nights, when the margin between success and failure narrowed to a single touch, he was often the man who delivered. This is the story of one of Spanish football's most effective number nines, a striker who was shaped in the penalty box, defined by the Champions League, and remembered far more quietly than his record suggests. Fernando Morientes Sanchez was born on the 5th of April 1976 in Celeros, a small town in the province of Caceres, Extremadura. Extremadura is not a region associated with footballing privilege. It has never been a centre of power in Spanish football, never a place where pathways were clear or opportunities were abundant. Historically, it's been rural, economically modest, and geographically distant from the academies and infrastructures that have helped shape Spain's elite players. It's a region where you don't expect to be discovered, you're expected to endure. And for Morientes, Extremadura was not where his football education truly began, but it did shape his mindset, and that would define him throughout his career. The idea that nothing arrives early, that effort precedes reward, and that patience is not optional. When his family moved north to Toledo in Castilla-La Mancha, it wasn't about making a footballing leap. There was no famous badge waiting, no prestigious youth structure, no sense of destiny for Morientes. It was simply to be closer to opportunity, and in turn, closer to organised football, closer to competitive leagues, and closer to being noticed by somebody who mattered. It was there, in the town of Sonseca, that Fernando Morientes learned what football actually was. Sonseca didn't offer development plans or technical philosophies. It offered games, real games, played on imperfect pitches in uncomfortable weather and against opponents who were not concerned about your future. This was regional football, played below the professional tiers, a mix of amateur and semi-professional players who often trained at night after working during the day, and they treated matches as personal territory rather than performance. The grounds were modest, the stands were close, and the crowd was vocal, not curated, not polite, and you could hear everything. Encouragement shouted from behind the goal, whether it was criticism from the touchline. Advice mid-match from people who genuinely believed that they understood the game better than you. And the defenders weren't always young men learning their trade like Morientes. They were older, stronger, and much more deeply pragmatic. They didn't care how clean your first touch was. They cared whether you were still standing after the challenge. And in that environment, Morientes didn't just learn how to shine, he learned how to survive. He was not the kind of player who dominated matches. He didn't dribble past three opponents and dictate the tempo. He scored goals like a striker should. Headers from corners when he arrived late. Loose ball finishes when others hesitated. Near post runs defenders didn't track because they were too busy watching the ball instead of the space. He didn't demand attention, but when he entered the box, he seemed to know almost instinctively where it would land, and that instinct mattered. Fonseca taught Morientes something football often forgets to teach young players, that most goals aren't beautiful, they're not the most decisive moments, are not dramatic. They're about being in the right place at the right time whilst others are thinking about something else. He'd learn how to hold his position while centre-backs were too busy leaning into him, how to jump when the ground beneath you was uneven, and how to calmly stay without one real chance when the match finally arrived. In regional football, reputation means nothing. Every weekend resets the hierarchy, and you are judged again and again and again. Morientes didn't leave Fonseca with hype, no. He left with habits. Habits that would follow him into La Liga, into the Champions League, into finals where one coach could decide history. And in many ways, everything that followed, the headers at the Bernabeu, the goals in Europe, the nights where space disappeared and pressure increased, can be traced back to those early lessons. Because long before he was trusted on Europe's biggest stage, Fernando Morientes had already learned how to compete where no one else was watching. When Fernando Morientes arrived at Albacete Balompié, football stopped being an idea for him then and became a profession. Between 1993 and 1995, he made 22 La Liga appearances, scoring 5 goals across 2 seasons. On paper, it looks modest, almost unforgettable. In reality, it was actually quite decisive. Albacete in the mid-1990s were not a club built for patience. They were fighting for relevance, for survival, the points that mattered immediately. Matches were not laboratories for development. They weren't experimental, they were examinations. And young players were not protected from that pressure. They were exposed to it. Morientes was still a teenager, learning what it meant to share a pitch with those defenders who had already built entire careers on knowing how to survive relegation battles. These were centre-backs who didn't chase the ball, they chased the space. They didn't jump early, they waited. They didn't foul dramatically, they nudged, leaned and unsettled. For a young striker, the message was clear. You will not be given anything. So whilst the minutes came in fragments and the starts were rare, and mistakes were unfortunately remembered, Morientes learned quickly that professional football was not about confidence, it was about readiness. You might wait 90 minutes without a clear sighted goal, and then suddenly the ball would drop loose in the box, and if you hesitated, the chance was gone. And if you panicked, well, it was even worse. Those early appearances forced him to sharpen the instincts he'd already begun to develop in Fonseca. He learned to stay alive in the box when the game drifted away from him. He kept adjusting his position by inches, not meters, to read where rebounds might fall rather than going where crosses were intended to go. At Albacete, it gave Morientes the chance to learn the rhythm of elite football. Training sessions that had intensity to them, not indulgence. Tactical instructions that were functional, not philosophical. Preparation that focused on opposition weaknesses rather than the freedom of personal expression. He wasn't asked to be a creative player. He was asked to be useful, and that suited him. Coaches saw a striker who didn't complain about his role. He would accept rotation. He trained as if he might play because often he didn't know until later in the week if he would or not. More importantly, they saw a young centre-forward who understood that his job was not to dominate games, but to decide them. Decide when those moments arrived that he would be the one who changed them. The goals he scored at Albacete wouldn't be always remembered as being spectacular, but they will always be remembered as being important. They didn't turn Morientes into a star. They did something far more valuable for him. They stripped back the game to the essentials and taught him what football costs when the margins are tight and patience is thin. And by the time that he left, Morientes had learned something many talented footballers never fully grasp. Football, especially in professional terms, isn't always about proving how good you are. It's proving that you can be trusted. Trusted to be ready. Trusted to be disciplined. Trusted to take responsibilities when others hesitate. And those lessons would stay with him long after he left Castilla-La Mancha. He would resurface in Zaragoza, and that role would also define him at Real Madrid, and it would be most visible on those European nights when one chance is the only one you might get. Albacete wasn't a stepping stone in a romantic sense, it was a test, and Morientes passed it quietly. And when Real Zaragoza signed Fernando Morientes in the summer of 1995, they were not buying a finished striker, they were buying a prospect, a possibility. Zaragoza at that time occupied a particular space in Spanish football. They were not a giant, but they weren't on the periphery either. They were a club with European pedigree, domestic ambition, and a clear idea of how they wanted to play. Under Victor Muñoz, Zaragoza valued order over chaos. Their football was structured, transitional, and pragmatic. They didn't just dominate possession for the sake of it. They sought clarity. Quick possession through the midfield, early balls into the channels, and decisive action in the final third. For a striker, that environment is quite demanding. You had to understand space, you had to time your runs, you had to accept that you might spend long stretches without the ball and still expect it to be ready. However, for Fernando Morientes, that suited him. He fitted in immediately. In his first season, 1995-96, he scored 13 La Liga goals, finishing as Zaragoza's leading scorer. But those goals weren't a result of freedom or indulgence. They came from discipline, listening to the coach, listening to the manager, and doing exactly as he'd been asked. Morientes learned to read the game in phases, to recognise when Zaragoza were defending deep and they were about to break, that he just had to delay his movement just long enough to stay onside, but also just far enough to separate him away from his marker. He was not the type of striker who demanded the ball to feet, no. He demanded space, and he learned how to create it through movement rather than speed. Central to that development was his partnership with his fellow striker Juan Eduardo Esnaida. Esnaida was a combative, mobile and aggressive player. He pressed defenders, dropped into pockets, dragged centre-backs out of shape, and Morientes complemented that perfectly. Where Esnaida moved, Morientes waited. Where Esnaida disrupted, Morientes arrived. And it was not a glamorous partnership, no. It was functional and it worked. And by the 1996-1997 season, Morientes had also taken another step in his career, scoring 15 league goals and finishing amongst the most reliable strikers in Spain. More importantly, he became Zaragoza's reference point in attack. The players teammates would look for when those games tightened. Tactically, Zaragoza asked a lot of him. He was expected to occupy both centre-backs even when he was isolated, to contest every aerial ball without always winning them cleanly, to create those second ball situations so midfielders running in, arriving late. And Morientes learned that not every duel was about winning the header. Sometimes it was about directing it and turning chaos into an advantage. And when Zaragoza finished fourth that season, securing qualification for European football, it was a significant achievement for the club. A club that operates well below the financial power of Spain's elite. But for Fernando Morientes, it was a confirmation. a confirmation that he'd arrived, that he was not just hype, he was not just promise, he was proof that he could cut it at the top level. But with that proof becomes an understanding, and by now, defenders knew exactly what he offered. They marked him tighter, they leaned on him harder, they tried to disrupt his rhythm early and get into his head. But Morientes had learned something vital at Zaragoza, and that is how to stay effective even when you are contained. Away from the pitch, Zaragoza offered him something else as well. Continuity. He was playing regular football, he was trusted, and he was not rotated when he was out of form. That consistency allowed him to refine his habits, how he trained, how he prepared, how he managed games when the goals didn't come early. And by that second season, Morientes was no longer a young striker learning his trade. He was a La Liga forward with 2 consecutive high-output seasons, a player who had scored goals in different systems under different pressures against different type of defenders, and people were starting to notice. Real Madrid noticed. And not because Morientes had dazzled, but because he had delivered repeatedly, reliably, without drama. And more than that, that made him ready for his next move. So when Fernando Morientes arrives at Real Madrid in the summer of 1997, he did so without ceremony. There was no unveiling built around him, no narrative about a new era, no suggestion that he was going to be the future of the club. Despite being 21 years old, he was arriving quietly, the most demanding environment in European football. At Real Madrid, development is a luxury rarely afforded. You are not taught how to cope with the shirt, you are tested by it. And that weight arrives immediately. And if you're not ready, it shows. Morientes was ready. Not because he was spectacular, but he was clear about what he needed to do. And under Jupp Heynckes, Real Madrid were not a team built on indulgence at that time. The squad was talented, but the football was pragmatic. The balance mattered. The structure mattered. And in attack, Madrid needed a striker who could provide a reference point and reliability rather than that constant movement. Morientes understood this brief instinctively. He stayed central. He would occupy both centre-backs. He'd resist the temptation to drift wide or drop deep unless it served the team. And whether other young strikers would have tried to impress, Morientes just focused on his usefulness. And that clarity for Morientes helped immediately shape a relationship with Raúl. Raúl was not a fixed striker. He drifted, dropped into space. He arrived late into the box, and his game depended on freedom. The presence of Morientes allowed that freedom to exist. And by holding the central channel, Morientes would pin defenders into place. Centre-backs couldn't step out to follow Raúl without leaving space behind them. And in that chaos, fullbacks would hesitate to tuck in, so lines became stretched, not subtly, but decisively. This isn't a coincidence of football. This is spatial intelligence from 2 of Europe's top strikers. Tactically, Madrid's shape became clear. Morientes was the anchor, Raúl was the movement. One fixed point, one variable. In his first season, Morientes scored 12 goals in all competitions. Those goals came in different ways, whether they were headers, close-range finishes, second balls, but the pattern was consistent. He arrived where those defenders had momentarily lost focus. Importantly, again, he didn't do this without the game revolving around him. Morientes had learned quickly to function inside Madrid's hierarchy. He didn't take free kicks, he didn't demand penalties, he didn't seek antagonism outside of the box. Instead, he focused on timing. He knew when to press, when to drop 5 yards, when to hold his ground. And in domestic matches, this often meant doing the invisible work, occupying defenders so midfielders could shoot, creating lanes for wide players to cross early, turning scrappy possessions into territorial pressure. And at the Bernabeu, those details mattered. Supporters won't have sung his name with the same volume as others, coaches trusted him. And when Madrid needed structure, particularly against organised opponents, Morientes was one of the first names on the pitch. He also learned the physical demands of elite football at speed, because where La Liga defenders were technical, European opponents were different. They were stronger, sometimes more direct, but certainly less patient. But Morientes once again adapted without complaint. He learned how to absorb contact without fouling. He contested those area balls without losing balance and managed games where touches were few and space was rationed. He also learned restraint. And at Real Madrid, impatience is punished because strikers who chase the game too aggressively often open up spaces behind them. So Morientes had to resist that urge and trust his role, trust that if he stayed disciplined, the chances would come. And they usually did. And by the end of his first season, Morientes had something far more valuable than that. He belonged at the club. In a club where many talented players never truly do feel valuable or belong. So this was no small achievement. And at Real Madrid, domestic football is the expectation. European football is the judgment. And the Champions League was where reputations were formed and where they could be dismantled just as quickly. For a striker like Fernando Morientes, it became the arena where his value was clearest, because Europe rewarded qualities that league football often overlooked. In the 1997-98 Champions League, Morientes was still young, still learning the way to the shirt, but he was already trusted. He scored 4 goals in a campaign as Real Madrid ended a 32-year wait for a European Cup. He didn't score in the final in Amsterdam. That moment belonged to somebody else, but Morientes' contribution across the tournament was essential. Madrid's route to the trophy had been tight and physical. Matches were often decided by margins rather than moments of brilliance. Morientes learned quickly that in Europe, the striker's job was not always to score. It was to occupy, to hold defenders in place, and to turn crosses into pressure even when they didn't end up in goals. That understanding deepened with experience, and by 1999-2000, Morientes was no longer adapting to European football. He was shaping it. He scored 5 goals in the Champions League campaign, and this time he delivered on the biggest night of them all. In the final in Paris was an all-Spanish Champions League football final. Real Madrid against Valencia at the Stade de France. It was tense, cautious, and emotionally heavy. Finals rarely up on their own. But Morientes opened it. In the 39th minute, he rose between defenders and headed Real Madrid into the lead, converting a cross from Michel Salgado, and it was a classic Morientes goal. No drama, no excess movement, just perfect positioning and timing. The goal changed the night. Steve McManaman's volley soon followed. Raul, with a late finish, completed the scoreline. It was a Morientes header that cracked the final open and gave Madrid control. They won 3-0 that night, and Morientes had scored in the biggest match of the season against a Spanish rival on the grandest stage. It was his moment, even if it never quite became his image. And then again, in 2000-2001, Madrid fell short in the semi-finals, but once again, Morientes remained a constant. He continued to score throughout the group stages and continued to be a focal point that gave Madrid structure. And then, in 2001-2002, Madrid reached the final at Hampden Park. They faced Bayer Leverkusen. And that match would be forever remembered for Zinedine Zidane's volley, an image that has become to define the competition itself. But before that moment, before the artistry and the highlight reels, the match was being fought elsewhere. It was in the penalty box, in between the centre-backs, in that space where Morientes lived. He played the entire final, contesting every aerial ball, pinning defenders, absorbing contact, and preventing Leverkusen from stepping out comfortably. He may not have scored, he may not even have assisted, but he did the work that allowed others to decide history, and that was the epitome of Morientes in Europe. not decorative, not symbolic, functional in the purest sense. And across 4 Champions League campaigns with Real Madrid, Morientes scored consistently, became important, became dependable. Coaches trusted him to do the work. Teammates trusted him to get them results. And opponents planned for him, even though he wasn't the headline threat. And yet, as Real Madrid entered the Galactico era, that reliability became harder to quantify. Football began to demand different things from strikers. Morientes hadn't changed. The Champions League never stopped rewarding him, but slowly, Real Madrid did. Change at Real Madrid didn't arrive with noise, it arrived with certainty. And when the Galacticos era began, it was not presented as a rejection of what had come before. It was framed as an evolution. Football catching up with a spectacle. Identity expanding beyond the pitch. And inside the dressing room, the effect was immediate. Suddenly, roles would shift, priorities would change, and balance became secondary. With the arrival of Ronaldo in 2002, it didn't make Fernando Morientes a worse striker. It simply altered the gravitational centre of the team. So where Morientes had once been the reference point, a player that others worked around, he now became a consideration. At Real Madrid, consideration is rarely enough. Ronaldo didn't occupy defenders in the same way that Morientes did. He demanded space to attack rather than space to control. He wanted the ball nice and early. He wanted momentum. He wanted freedom. And that freedom comes at a cost. With Ronaldo leading the line, Madrid's shape became looser. Even Raul was forced to adjust, often drifting wide or deeper to accommodate the new hierarchy. Midfielders were asked to serve moments rather than manage phases of play. And for Morientes, the problem was not competition, it was compatibility. He and Ronaldo occupied similar vertical spaces, but asked very different questions of defenders. So where Morientes would slow the game down by being present, Ronaldo accelerated it by attacking the space. Where Morientes anchored structure, Ronaldo pulled it apart. And ultimately, Madrid chose acceleration. And from the outside, it looked inevitable. Morientes began to drift from the centre of matches. He wasn't immediately dropped, not openly dismissed, but rotated, adjusted, repositioned. His minutes became conditional, his role became situational, and yet his instincts didn't change. He'd still attack the box. He'd still hold his position. He still trusted timing over volume. Madrid were filling with stars, players whose influence extended beyond the tactic board, beyond training sessions, beyond results. Attention shifted, focus fractured, and where once a collective clarity had been enough, now individual brilliance was expected to solve everything. Morientes wasn't built for that environment. He remained what he always had been, a striker who trusted systems, roles, and repetitions. And as managers changed and the structures loosened, the value that Morientes had became harder to articulate. He wasn't failing at Real Madrid, he was being outgrown by an idea. And that irony was pretty sharp. Just as Madrid were chasing spectacle, Morientes were becoming more valuable in Europe, the one competition that still rewarded discipline, patience, and positional intelligence. But Madrid's priorities had shifted. And with Euro 2004 approaching, Morientes had to face a familiar choice that many players of his type have. Stay and diminish, or leave and prove. Prove that you are still the player that you are still good enough. And he chose movement. In January 2003, he left the club on loan. Not in protest, not in conflict with the club, just in a quiet acknowledgement that football had stopped asking questions he was best at answering. The Galactico era didn't erase Fernando Morientes, it simply moved the centre of gravity to somewhere he could no longer stand. The move to Monaco was not framed as redemption, it was framed as practicality. Under Didier Deschamps, Monaco were a team built on clarity rather than charisma. They didn't dominate possession, they didn't overwhelm opponents with talent, but they competed through organisation, timing, and belief. In many ways, they were the opposite of the Galacticos, and that suited Morientes perfectly. From the moment he arrived, his role was clear. He was not there to roam, he was there to anchor, to be that reference point of which everything else moved, a role he was so familiar with now in his career. Monaco would play vertical football, they'd progress the ball quickly, they'd play through wide areas and trusted early deliveries into the box. They wanted runners from the midfield, they wanted chaos in the final third, but controlled chaos. And Morientes gave them order inside the box. Once again, by occupying those centre-backs relentlessly, contesting everything in the air, and slowing games down simply by being present. Where Monaco, in some cases, were young and energetic, Morientes offered them calm. Where they pressed aggressively, he conserved the moment, and when they rushed, he waited. And the Champions League amplified everything about it. In the 2003-2004 campaign, Morientes rediscovered the rhythm he had lost in Madrid. He scored 9 goals as he finished as the competition's top goal scorer. Not through volume of chances, but through that precision of movement. He'd scored in the group stage, he'd scored in the knockouts, he'd scored when Monaco needed belief. And belief well and truly arrived when that draw was made. Real Madrid in the knockout stages. The tie was framed as inevitable. The Galacticos of Real Madrid against a French side, basically borrowing one of their own. Monaco was spoken about as a story, whereas Madrid was spoken about as destiny. The first leg of the Bernabeu seemed to confirm it. Real Madrid had won 4-2 and the match felt open, controlled, predictable. And yet, if you look inside that scoreline, something had shifted. Morientes was on the score sheet, but not for Real Madrid, but for Monaco. A header, a timely reminder, and a goal that would change the arithmetic of the tie and the psychology of it. Of course, he wouldn't celebrate. He didn't acknowledge the moment. He simply turned and jogged back to the centre circle. In the second leg, at the Stade Louis II, it was different. This time, Monaco pressed intelligently. They trusted their shape, and they trusted that Madrid, as brilliant as they were, would leave spaces. And more importantly, they trusted Morientes. Early in that game, a cross came in from the left, and Morientes attacked it with conviction. Not with emotion, but with instinct. He rose, he headed down, and he scored. Again, no celebration, only focus. Monaco went on to win that game 3-1, meaning the aggregate score finished 5-5. Monaco would advance on away goals. Fernando Morientes had eliminated Real Madrid, his parent club, by doing exactly what Madrid once relied on him to do. It wasn't revenge, it was validation for Morientes. And Monaco carried that belief forward. Again, in the semi-finals, they were disciplined, brave, and unafraid. Morientes was on the score sheet again, providing Monaco with a platform they needed to reach the final. And by the time they arrived in Gelsenkirchen, Morientes had become the tournament's defining striker. Not the fastest, not the flashiest, but the most dependable. And despite the final itself being cruel, where Porto, led by Jose Mourinho, were much sharper, much more ruthless, giving a sense that Monaco were overwhelmed by the Portuguese side. The 3-0 scoreline told the story beautifully, but the campaign was already complete. Morientes had reached a Champions League final as the competition's top goal scorer. He knocked out the most powerful club in Europe, and he'd not done so by reinventing himself, but by returning to his essence. Monaco didn't give Morientes a new identity. They gave him the space to remember who he already was. In doing so, they delivered the purest rebuttal of his career. Not to critics, not to Madrid, but to a version of football that had briefly forgotten what he was for. So after Monaco, when Fernando Morientes returned to Real Madrid carrying proof, not promise, proof, he'd been the Champions League top goal scorer, he'd reached a final, he'd eliminated Madrid along the way. But even with all that, the centre of gravity at the Bernabeu was far too removed. And it wasn't a dramatic decision, it was a logical decision that Fernando Morientes would end up leaving the club. In January 2005, Morientes joined Liverpool for a fee of £6.3 million. On paper, it made sense. Not only were Liverpool a club defined by European nights of tactical intelligence and collective effort, but Rafael Benitez was implementing a Spanish revolution at Anfield, a revolution that valued structure, valued discipline, and positional responsibility amongst all else. All those qualities that Morientes understood instinctively. But unfortunately, football isn't played on paper, and the Premier League asks different questions. The tempo was relentless, and the matches were constant. You rarely paused long enough for a striker to settle into a rhythm. At Liverpool, Morientes often found himself between ideas. Asked to lead the line, but without the sustained territorial pressure that he'd known in Spain or France. Crosses arrived from deeper areas, second balls fell wider, and the box, which was 1 minute crowded, suddenly emptied the next. Tactically, it was a difficult fit. Morientes thrived on structure, on patterns repeated until instinct took over. But in Liverpool, in a period where the team was still in flux, the pressing was intense, the service was inconsistent, and the midfield rotated. Wide plays would change, and that rhythm was hard to find. He also arrived in Liverpool with a limitation that nobody could ignore. He was cup-tied in Europe, unable to play in the Champions League, the competition that had always brought out the best. On European nights, he was forced to watch from the stands. And that absence mattered to Morientes. Across 41 appearances, he'd scored 8 goals. He'd worked relentlessly. He'd adapted the best that he could and had scored some important goals, including in domestic competitions, and would lift the FA Cup in 2006. But the connection never quite formed. And it wasn't about effort or professionalism. It was about alignment. And by the time that May 2006 rolled round, Liverpool and Morientes had made a quiet decision. It was time to move on. With no bitterness, only realism. On his arrival at Mestalla, Valencia felt different immediately. Returning to Spain, Morientes found a football culture that not only spoke his language physically, but emotionally too. There was tactical organisation, there was positional clarity, phases of play that would unfold with intention rather than urgency. And Valencia at this time were also a club in transition. Clearly talented, but unstable, and searching for an equilibrium after that Benitez era. What they needed was not spectacle. They needed a reference point, and Morientes became that. Alongside David Villa, he offered contrast rather than competition. Villa, like he did with Raul at Real Madrid, would attack the space explosively, whilst Morientes anchored the box. As we've already mentioned, when Villa moved, Morientes waited. When Villa disrupted, Morientes would finish. And in the 2006-2007 season, he'd go on to score 12 league goals, but his influence went far beyond numbers. He helped slow matches down, gave structure to attacking phases. He provided an outlet when Valencia were under pressure. All that invisible work that a striker does. He became a leader without an armband. Over 3 seasons, he played through managerial changes, tactical adjustments, and institutional uncertainty. And amongst this, in 2008, amid that instability, Valencia lifted the Copa del Rey. It was not a triumph built on dominance, but built on resilience. And for Morientes, it felt fitting. He was no longer the striker expected to define an era. He was the striker that people trusted to hold things together. By the time he reached an age where his role began to fade, it did so gently. There was no abrupt decline, no dramatic fall-off, just the gradual understanding that the body no longer responded as it once had. When he left Valencia, Morientes did so with something rare in modern football: respect. Where England had asked him to change, Spain had asked him to contribute. And in answering those questions honestly, Fernando Morientes closed the final chapter of his league career in the same way he had written the first. And by the time that Fernando Morientes stepped away from football in 2010, following a final spell at Marseille, there was no farewell tour. There was no grand announcement. No sense that an era was ending, even though one quietly was. By the time he retired, football had already begun asking different questions of its strikers. Where once a forward was judged on anticipation, positioning, and timing, the modern game began to value mobility above all else. Pressing forwards, false nines, players who vacated the box as quick as they entered it. The centre forward, once the game's fixed point, became fluid. And in that shift, something subtle was lost. Fernando Morientes belongs to a lineage of striker who understood the penalty area as a living space, something that breathed, contracted, expanded, and punished those who misunderstood it. He didn't chase the game, he waited for it. He didn't demand touches, he trusted moments. He believed instinctively that football's most decisive actions happened in places where there was no room to improvise, and that belief helped shape his career. Whilst at Real Madrid, he was not the most gifted player. At Monaco, he wasn't the most celebrated. At Liverpool, he wasn't the best fit. But everywhere he went, when structure existed, he mattered. The irony is that Morientes' career now feels clearer in retrospect than it did ever in real time. During his playing days, he was often measured against the wrong things. Against speed, against flair, against spectacle, against the players football had decided to market rather than understand. And only later does this shape of his contribution emerge. 3 Champions League titles, goals in finals, tournament-leading scorer that rewrote expectations, reliability at the highest level sustained over years. And yet, he's rarely mentioned amongst the game's great forwards. Not because he lacked achievement, but because the football struggles to remember players whose excellence was conditional rather than constant. Players who mattered most when games were hardest, not easiest. Morientes didn't redefine the striker's role, he completed it. He represented the final refinement of a position that once sat at the centre of the game's logic. A striker whose value was measured not by touches or assists, but by gravity, by how his presence altered everything around him. Defenders didn't even feel him when they touched the ball. Midfielders trusted him even though the pass wasn't on. The modern game still produces goal scorers, but what it produces less often are specialists. Players who understand one role deeply enough to shape matches without leaving obvious fingerprints behind. Fernando Morientes' legacy won't be found in highlight reels. It will live in patterns, in movements remembered by teammates rather than the crowd, in moments when space vanished. Football didn't move on from Fernando Morientes. Football didn't fail Fernando Morientes. It had moved on from the idea that a striker could be still, that patience could beat chaos, that waiting could actually be an act of intelligence. When football stopped asking for players like him, it did not replace them. It replaced a role. And perhaps that's why years later, his career feels quietly instructive rather than nostalgic. A reminder that football's most important answers aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they arrive without ceremony. A step between defenders, a rise above the noise, and a header might just settle a final. Thank you for taking your time to listen, not just to a career, but a story about patience, timing, and a kind of football that's slowly fading from view. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find El Partido on social media, where we show more than stories, memories, moments from the history of the game, and ones that still linger long after the final whistle, all with a nostalgic twist. And if you'd like to hear more episodes like this, please follow and subscribe to El Partido, wherever you get your podcasts. It really does make a difference, and it helps these stories keep finding their way to people who care about them. But until next time, hasta luego.